From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Wednesday, April 15th, 2015. Iraq's Haider Al Abadi visits the United States for the first time as Prime Minister. Will examine the state of U.S.-Iraq relations. And as the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide approaches, we'll find out why there's still so much political reluctance among elites to acknowledge that the genocide happened. Finally, Nestle's water bottling operation in California, in the face of a crippling drought, has activists up in arms. We'll turn to the Courage campaign. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
Hundreds of people protested against police brutality in several cities around the country yesterday. 12 people were arrested on New York's Brooklyn Bridge when they marched alongside about 250 others. In Madison, Wisconsin, about 100 people blocked a major road. In Oakland, hundreds of people marched outside a police department and along a freeway. In San Francisco, about 100 people circled a police station and went on to speak out at a city council meeting. Activists also briefly blocked the Bay Bridge from San Francisco to Oakland. In Los Angeles, where it appears the largest number of people were arrested, about 100 people blocked metro rail tracks. Officers took 15 people into custody. Many of those who marched in various cities were young, some even high school students. And separately, a group called the Justice League NYC is leading a march of activists from New York to Washington, D.C.'s National Mall. Well, Courtney, these protests have gotten very little media coverage. I mean, there's been local coverage, but outside of Reuters, almost no national coverage. Even Venezuela's Telesur network covered the protests. Imagine if these were right-wing protesters.
I mean, I definitely think that the relative lack of coverage is pretty shocking. And, you know, I was reading the New York Times this morning and I had to literally search for the story about the protests on the Brooklyn Bridge, and it was buried in the New York City section 4 headlines down. And considering that all these protests were taking place in other parts of the country, clearly it wasn't just a city issue. It's a matter of national politics. And so, you know, I think that what this shows us, you know, what this reminds us is that you know, the major mainstream media networks, unlike Uprising, are corporate entities, and they're run by folks who have largely conservative political interests. And so since the right has really been unable to shut the protests down or to discredit them, I think one of the strategies that we're seeing emerging is to diminish the importance and the impact of these protests by simply not covering them or covering them inaccurately. And, you know, and we've seen this before. And so, you know, what I think is encouraging in all of this, though, is that these are young protesters who are very media savvy, and they're taking advantage of all of the new social media tools that they have available, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, to create their own narratives, their own media stories about what's happening, and keeping that story alive and forcing the mainstream media to engage with them.
Right. And elsewhere in the U.S., another protest with scant U.S. media coverage is taking place, this time behind bars in South Texas. Migrant mothers from Mexico and Central America being held at privately run detention centers in squalid conditions are on hunger strike. The euphemistically named Carnes Family Residential Center houses more than 500 undocumented immigrants. Among the allegations of abuse are sexual assault and inadequate and poor quality food. Children are being held with their mothers, at least some of whom have already passed their credible fear interviews to qualify for asylum. The Guardian reported that one mother was held in solitary confinement with her 2-year-old child. As part of their protest of these terrible conditions, many mothers are refusing meals and other services until their concerns are addressed. Well, Courtney, how much of a measure of American barbarism is this story?
I mean, the criminalization of undocumented immigrants in this country and the way that they're treated by our criminal justice system is really I mean, I think it calls into question all of the democratic values that we claim to hold sacred here. I mean, the family detention centers are especially awful. We know that mothers and children are kept in inhumane conditions. They're denied due process of law, and their human rights can be and often are violated with impunity. And I think that what we're seeing happen here is even more distressing when we consider the fact that most of these people are coming precisely because they're seeking asylum and relief from unlivable conditions in their home countries, many of which have been exacerbated by U.S. foreign policy. And they come to the U.S. looking for relief, and instead we incarcerate them. And so I think this is shameful, and history will not be kind to us. When we are evaluated for the way that we allowed undocumented immigrants to be treated at this moment.
And history is likely not going to be kind to Europe as well. Hundreds of migrants attempting to enter Europe by boat have lost their lives. And what has become a depressingly familiar story of the more than 500 people who were on board a ship that left Libya heading for Italy earlier this week, only 144 survivors remain. Separately, over the weekend, Italian authorities rescued 8,500 migrants, but they were the lucky ones. In 2014, more than 3,000 migrants died at sea, and according to the International Organization for Migration, there have been an estimated 22,000 migrant deaths at sea since 2000. A record number of people are expected to try to cross into the European Union this year alone. Most of them come from countries ravaged by poverty and war, such as Libya, Syria, Eritrea, and Somalia. At one time, Italy had launched a dedicated program for migrants called Mare Nostrum, but then abandoned it after a year, even though it saved over 100,000 lives. Courtney, are people making enough connections with the policies being pushed by Western governments that drive people to leave their homes in the first place?
Well, there are always people, I think, who can connect the dots and see the bigger picture. But, on the whole, I think that what we see in mainstream media coverage of these events is a tendency to treat them as isolated or separate incidents and not to really analyze the larger forces that produce these kinds of tragedies. I mean, when war and militarism and economic crisis make people's home countries unlivable, they are pushed into making the kinds of risky decisions that can result in what we saw happen this week. And I think that, you think about a Libyan citizen, what must he or she think when he or she looks around and sees the country descending into civil war and chaos? They must think to themselves, I have nothing to lose. And so I think, again, like the women who are in detention centers in South Texas, these are people who are really the victims of, sort of the hangover, the afterlife of the Cold War. And they are political refugees, and we should treat them as such.
Courtney, thanks as always for joining us.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Gohatkar. Iraqi Prime Minister Haider Al Abadi is in the United States this week. He's meeting President Obama in Washington, D.C. for the first time since he took the reins of Iraq 7 months ago. During his visits, he's requested additional aid from the U.S. to help combat the Islamic State rebel group that began taking over major cities and towns in northern Iraq last year. President Obama has responded with $200 million in aid, but that is in addition to the military operations that the U.S. is engaged in on the ground. In the past 6 months, about 3,000 U.S. troops returned to Iraq, apparently to strictly train the Iraqi National Army rather than engage in direct combat. U.S. troops had left Iraq in 2011 as part of a planned withdrawal. Prime Minister Al Abadi has also apparently raised concerns about the role of Iran, with whom it shares a border, about Iranian Shia forces playing a lead role in the frontline battles against the Islamic State. President Obama warned Iran, with whom it is currently engaged in productive nuclear talks, to, quote, respect Iraqi sovereignty. There have been major battles to retake the city of Mosul from ISIS. And just this week, troubling reports are emerging of the key city of Ramadi possibly falling into the hands of ISIS. My guest is Nabil Al-Tikriti. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia. Hi, Nabil.
Hello.
Well, thanks for joining us. Now, Haider Al Abadi has been in power for about 7 months now after his predecessor, Nouri al Maliki, was essentially pushed out for marginalizing Sunni communities, among other things. How do you assess Abadi's leadership? Or should we simply see him as a puppet of the U.S., or does he actually have independence?
I wouldn't rate him so far as behaving like a puppet of the U.S., not at all. He seems to be stuck in a very difficult place, just like his predecessor, al-Maliki was, and he's trying to weave a very delicate path. The big negative that I've heard about his administration was when he first came into power, he appointed his cabinet, and one of the key cabinet positions, one of the key portfolios was the Ministry of Interior. And the person that he appointed to the Minister of Interior portfolio was one of the former heads of the Badr Corps, which is controversial within Iraqi politics because it's considered to be quite sectarian in the modern history of the last 30 years of Iraq. Aside from that appointment, and maybe a couple of others that I've also heard about, his performance cannot be said to be as sectarian as Maliki's had been. So on the whole, it's a bit of an improvement is the evaluation that I hear the most.
Now, what do you make of the $200 million that the United States has pledged to Iraq? It's supposedly going to be humanitarian aid. President Obama said, quote, there are individual families and children who have suffered as a result of the ISIS conflict. He's implying, I think, that they are going to be families and internally displaced refugees might be the beneficiaries of this aid?
I think that is a good signal. However, I would point out that $200 million strikes me as the normal amount of money that would be necessary as part of a general humanitarian assistance for the region in general. And by the region, I'm defining it as just Iraq within the region, because the UN constantly is putting out humanitarian donor appeals, and the amounts that total up come out to something like several $100 million, and the amount that the U.S. would be expected to contribute is about that amount. I mean, I don't have the exact figures. And therefore, I think what's interesting about this is the timing of it. In other words, they decided to roll out what strikes me as a very normal ponying up of U.S. funding of an international humanitarian effort on the occasion of Abadi's visit. So it's not actually a major initiative. It's not unusual. It's not a negative thing, but it's not a huge positive either. So it's kind of a meh reaction.
Well, the New York Times yesterday had an interesting piece on the U.S. troops that have returned to Iraq, only to find that the Iraqi National Army is in a state of disarray, rife with corruption, also desertion. It had a very patronizing tone, in my opinion, as if, one were profiling a teacher or a parent who caught a child being naughty and was disappointed in them. I'm wondering how you assess such coverage that just seems to be devoid of the historical context.
I agree with what you're saying about the tone. It was somewhat patronizing, and that does fit the entire sort of history of U.S. intervention and advising in the region. That said, the general observations made by that article I find to be accurate. Mm-hmm. And it is true that the Iraqi military has devolved into something that's really not very effective at all. And the major reason for that is systemic corruption. And to me, the systemic corruption that is the Iraqi military today was almost an intentional effect of the way that the post-2003 order was set up. So, when they got rid of the old Iraqi military, when they got rid of effectively the state in 2003 and into 2004, and then rebuilt it from scratch, they almost systemically built something that would be inherently corrupted. And in so doing, you've got things like fake rolls and kickbacks for weapons contracts, so that when the actual military is forced to fight a real battle, they're completely ineffective, which is why they're forced to go to these militia groups who are fighting for something, shall we say, more than just the Iraqi state.
Right, and so the battle, of course, that they're facing is one against an enemy that has been estimated to be about at least rather 20,000 strong. Iraq's entire army is estimated to be about 50,000 strong. Recently, Brett McGurk, presidential envoy on the coalition against ISIS, gave an interview to CNN, and he described the ISIS issue as a problem that is off the charts historically. Are the estimates of the numbers accurate, that a 50,000 strong Iraqi army that's in deep disarray is attempting to fight a 20,000 strong army that's very well organized?
It strikes me as consistent with what I'm hearing in general. In other words, the highest estimate that you ever hear for the Daesh military is something like 30,000.
Daesh being ISIS, yes.
Right, and the lowest estimate seems to be about 10,000, so 20 would appear to be the golden mean. What I find surprising in that observation is the idea that there's only 50,000 Iraqi state troops at this point, because at another point in that article, another estimate had it up around 141,000. And if you remember what was going on, say, 10, 20 years ago, they were said to be, in the late 80s, they were said to be well over 1 million under arms, even up to 1.5 million under arms. So they've clearly demobilized tremendously, but the demobilization combined with the corruption apparently means, if the observation is accurate that they only have 50,000, that they now have a shadow force of what they once were. And that strikes me as, again, effectively an intentional policy outcome of the order that was set up after 2003. Now, and these are the effects of that.
Right. Now, this meeting between Prime Minister Abadi and President Obama in D.C. is coming in the same week that a court has sentenced 4 former Blackwater employees to lengthy prison terms for a massacre in 2007 of 17 unarmed Iraqis in Nisour Square, Baghdad. One of the men got a life term and the other 3 30-year prison terms. How important has this trial been and the sentencing?
I have to say I was really surprised by that outcome. I would almost say pleasantly surprised, because it is one of the few outcomes in regards to the Iraq intervention that has come out on the side of justice, if you will. And the consensus opinion through most of the colleagues that I'm interacting with is that it is justice and it is a positive outcome. What I did find interesting was what one colleague said, and that is that eventually the state even eats its own, which is a very cynical observation, that in this case the state picked out its own soft targets, and that was the other part of his comment, was that these were soft targets, and by picking out these targets, the state allows the larger atrocities to continue. Now that's only one opinion, and I'm not sure I entirely agree with it, but the idea there is that they did actually, in this one case, bring about justice. Right. But another observation that I found that I agree with is that made by Burns, the former New York Times journalist, yesterday on the radio, was observing that really it's part of a much larger system failure in the last 10 years. And in a sense, these 4 individuals are being held up as the scapegoats for a much larger systemic failure. And I agree with that as well.
Well, then finally, speaking to that larger context, Physicians for Social Responsibility in March released a report on the occasion of the 12th anniversary of the U.S.'s invasion of Iraq, and they estimated that the Iraq war, they also covered the other wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but specifically to Iraq, it's estimated that 1 million Iraqis were killed both directly and indirectly as a result of the war. I mean, that's a horrific legacy. After this interview, we're going to be covering the Armenian Genocide, where 1.5 million Armenians were killed by Turkey, and the fight to call that a genocide continues. But shouldn't we be treating the U.S.'s legacy in Iraq with the same gravity with which other horrific wars have resulted in large numbers of people being killed?
You know, on this point, I'm actually intrigued that you're framing the question that way, because I think there are some interesting parallels, and one would be that the Turkish state to this day denies, among other things, intentionality for what most of the world calls the Armenian Genocide. And they say that it was more of an accidental policy, a series of unfortunate outcomes, something like that. And I actually, when you frame the U.S. Intervention today and you put it against the Armenian Genocide of yesterday, I would actually argue that a similar argument is always going to be there from the U.S. side, projecting forward as the debate about what happened in the last decade continues. There will be a denial of intentionality, and the denial will frankly be plausible, because I don't think anyone in Washington does intentionally want 1 million people to die over a decade. I don't know that anybody in Washington can be pinned with that kind of intentionality, and I don't think it exists. And I think that the framing in the future is going to be similar to the way that the Turkish state frames what happened not only in 1915, but between 1915 and around 1920.
Well, Nabil, it's always a pleasure to have you on. We hope to have you back on in the future. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
My guest, Nabil Al-Tikriti, is an associate professor of history at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show as well as a radio show? You can watch the show on Free Speech TV, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel for a very small monthly fee, which helps us sustain the costs of TV production. Find out more at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, the historical massacre of 1.5 million Armenians at the hands of Turkish forces. Pope Francis on Sunday made headlines once more, this time for using the term Armenian Genocide, as he referenced a 2001 declaration by the earlier Pope John Paul II.
In the past century, our human family has lived through 3 massive and unprecedented tragedies.
Tragedie inaudite. La prima, quella.
The first, which is widely considered the first genocide of the 20th century, struck your own Armenian people.
Del XX secolo. Essa ha colpito il vostro popolo armeno.
The use of the term genocide itself is highly controversial for Turkey, which immediately denounced the Pope's words, accusing him of fomenting, quote, hatred and animosity and making, quote, unfounded allegations. Turkey recalled its ambassador to the Vatican in retaliation. Naming the 1915 mass killing as a genocide has been a deeply emotional issue for the Armenian community, both inside Armenia and in the diaspora. In 2008, candidate Barack Obama publicly said that he would acknowledge the Armenian genocide as president. So far, he's refused to do so. Even UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who has often been unafraid to speak out on injustice, has skirted around using the G word. Still, about 20 countries and 43 U.S. states have formally recognized the genocide. Joining me in studio today is Salpi Gazarian. She is director of the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. Welcome to Uprising.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, April 24th is the actual date that is used to mark the anniversary of the genocide. But that actual date, 100 years ago, marks a very important moment. What happened on April 24th specifically?
April 24th is the day that we mark because that's the day that the Turkish government decided to begin by removing the heads, the leadership of the communities, and not just in the Anatolian cities to the east, on the eastern part of Turkey, but in Istanbul itself. And so that marked the beginning of a clear, intentional effort to do away with this population. And I do think that word, the intent, is the key in this, just as your previous guest, Nabil, just talked about.
So the artists and the intellectuals and the leaders?
Absolutely, because they were out to solve a problem. And I think this, at this time in history, 100 years later, today, with everything that's happening in the Middle East, it's really important to talk about what this was not. It was not an Islamic campaign against Christian Armenians. It was not simply a racist effort to do away with a people. They were out to solve a political problem. The political problem was that the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. You know, the Balkans, they had lost over the last several decades. To the east, T. Lawrence and the Arab revolts, they were really worried about losing the east as well. And here within the mainland was this population calling for reforms, civic reforms. And the Western powers, the Allies, for their own reasons, were backing this. And so Turkey thought, here is a way to do away with a political, a demographic problem. Let's just do away with these people. Everywhere where they are majorities, we will turn them into minorities. And today, we're still living the results of that. The part of this that's really hard for somebody like me, you know, I live in LA, I work at a wonderful university. Why does this still matter, right?
Yeah.
It matters because of several things. One is that today in Turkey, there is an Armenian community of 50 to 80,000, and beyond that, there are about 2 million Turks of Armenian origin. The grandmothers are dying, and on their deathbeds, they're saying, you know, those crazy pastries I used to make in the spring, those are Easter pastries that Armenians made that I remember from my mother. And so all of these hidden Islamized Armenians now, at the end of their lives, are remembering who they are. And so their children and grandchildren have this amazing dilemma. Are they now part of these traitor Armenians? Do they acknowledge who they are? So there's that population,
Sort
which
of
we
an
often...
existential identity crisis.
It's a terrible identity crisis. So there's that whole faction that we forget. The Republic of Armenia borders the Republic of Turkey.
Course, yeah.
And it is a matter of serious national security to live next to a country, a government, a regime that is not willing to acknowledge a political crime, even one that it did not commit.
Well, why is it such a political issue within Turkey to name this as a genocide? And also, why is there such reluctance internationally? I mean, I don't see the Turkish government having such a serious political influence that it would be able to sway the President of the United States, the Secretary General of the United Nations?
You know, all governments have a whole lot of things on their agendas, and I would wager a bet that the Armenian genocide recognition issue is not number one. So with all of the issues that all of these governments have with Turkey, this is not the one where they want to use their chips. And because often it is seen as simply an emotional, psychological, historical something in the past, without recognizing that, as I said, this is a national security issue for the Republic of Armenia, and it's an identity issue, an acknowledgement issue, a matter of integrity for me and my kids. Not only was my grandmother a deported child who only remembers her name because her mother screamed it as she was being dragged from her mother, and not only did we all live with that, in very specific everyday ways. You know, I would go get my hair cut short. To this day, I don't know what to do with my hair. I would go get my hair cut short, and she'd say, "Who made you cut your hair?" Because her long braids were cut off because she was just a servant or worse. Children were abducted, women were abducted, and we are all the survivors of the descendants. So it is not an ancient issue. And for the Republic of Turkey, because that's really the crux of the question, right? That's really your question.
Yeah.
It's an issue of identity. And it's both easy to understand and difficult to understand. The Republic of Turkey put aside their Ottoman past. They put aside a lot of good things, like language, like alphabet. But they were not able to reject, to call it by its name, the crime that was committed in the Ottoman years.
And
and now they live with that. Now
right.
they've explained their whole existence by the fact that Armenians never existed.
Right.
Now what do you say?
And then to turn it around would question everything. But Turkey does acknowledge there was a
painful moments.
Painful moments. Okay, that's the way they used to describe it. Do they deny the extent of the killings?
Yes, and they deny the intent.
And the intent. So the extent and the intent.
Yeah. To be fair, we must say that over the last 10 years, much has changed in Turkey. Both the AK party and the government and its intent to open up to the West, to deal with its neighbors in ways different from previous governments. Number one. Number two, the assassination of Hrant Dink, the editor of a newspaper that was both in Armenian and Turkish, which was the first time in 80 years, changed a lot. Turkish civil society stood up and said, we're all Hrant, we're all Armenian, we are all
And
responsible.
tell us a little bit about this very important figure, who's a very symbolic figure on this issue of the genocide, at least contemporarily.
Absolutely, and he represented the following message, that all of this is not about punishing Turkey. It's about allowing Turkey and Turkish society to breathe, to be done with this burden, to be done with these skeletons in the closet. I visit Turkey. I love Istanbul. I think it's a beautiful, wonderful city, and I feel at home there. I also visit Eastern Turkey, the regions from which my grandparents were born. And, you know, people will come up to you and say, here, eat this fruit. It's really yours. It's not as if those on the eastern side, the Turks, the Kurds, don't know what happened. They've lived with the legacy. And civil society in Turkey is recognizing that there are a lot of skeletons there that they must deal with. And Hrant Dink was the first one who spoke about that. He said, look, I am an Armenian, but I am also Turk. I don't want to turn this country upside down. I want this country to breathe, which is what I want. I do not want a part of Turkey. I want them to realize I am a part of that country.
And so then that does bring up this important question, which is when people who are Armenian want an acknowledgement of the genocide, to be called as such, what are they exactly looking for? Is it a moral question, or is it a legal and political question? Turkey did sign on to the Convention Against Genocide in 1950, of course, many years after the Armenian Genocide. Are there legal ramifications to admitting that they participated in a genocide?
I think that Turkey is concerned for all of those reasons. It is certainly a moral question. And although many will disagree with me, including many of my Armenian friends, I think at the end of the day, fundamentally for Turkey, this is a moral question. It is a question, it is a statement that would force them to reconsider their whole national narrative. You know, who are we? Where did we come from? There were no Armenians here. There were no Kurds here. There was nobody here. It was just us. And suddenly, you know, there are 40 minorities claiming their place in that history, in that narrative. It is a legal question. Genocide is a legal term, and it means intent to do away with a whole people. And the reason that term is important is because when you call a government on it, you're saying governments do not have the right to deal with internal political problems with mass violence. They do not, anywhere. And of course, all governments have. The United States has a history of violence. Germany has a history of violence, not just with the Jews, but in Namibia. So every government has that worry, but we must call them on it. And there are consequences. Of course there are consequences. I think most of them are moral, ethical, political consequences. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of accountability, and it's a matter of deciding, are you really the democratic leader of that region that you want to be, which is what Turkey says.
Right. How important were the words of Pope Francis?
You know, it's important because it restores a faith in right, in justice, and it gives us all hope that sometime, probably in my lifetime, I would like to say, this is something that we will be able to take off of the shoulders of young Armenians and young Turks and be able to really deal with all of the consequences that we share, psychological, traumatic, memory. We need to get past this. We're neighbors in the same damn region.
Are you disappointed by President Obama?
I know that many are. I think that what we need to do is take the words that are truthful, and everything that has been said every April 24th has been truthful. And it even speaks to intent. It does not use the word genocide, and I wish he would. But what is important for me is that the world recognize that this was a government dealing with a political problem, an existential problem, by doing away with my grandparents.
Yeah.
That is what is important to recognize. And if the intent of that, not the accidentalness, by the way, a few people died in war. And I think it's really important to say that what Prime Minister Erdogan did last year, and I'm sure he'll do it again this year.
The Turkish Prime Minister.
The Turkish Prime Minister then, President now, made a statement. that said, we share your pain, which was unprecedented. And
baby steps.
Not only baby steps, they're measuring all of this against these 10 years of their making efforts. They forget that we've been waiting 100 years. And so our reactions are never sufficient for them for those reasons. Yet something is moving, and it's our responsibility as thinking, progressive people everywhere to work with that segment of Turkish civil society that wants this as much as I do.
Sabi, what sort of activities are being held around the country to commemorate this event? I should mention here in Southern California, where this program is produced, we have the largest Armenian community outside Armenia. Does this issue become a topic around the dinner table? You mentioned young Armenians. We know a lot of young Armenians feel this issue. You know, everyone from Serge Tankian to Kim Kardashian hold it dear in their hearts. How are people commemorating it?
This is good because I do work at a university, and it gives me the opportunity to say the following, that especially the scholarly community around the world, not Armenians, Turks, Kurds, Germans, Israelis, have used this year to produce an amazing amount of research, publications, conferences, all that together with all of the artistic output of people like Serge, his colleagues, and individual community efforts, from religious services to musical events that just allow us to just sit back and think and really feel proud of the fact that we are where we are, and also remember the huge pain that was caused, not just to individuals who themselves were victims, but to the whole way of life that was lost and that continues to be a problem in the region and for the people. But I said scholarship, and I mean it. Turkish scholarship has come so far that every time when Turkish officials say what they must say, because that's the government line, that let history decide, history has decided. Except for a few historians in Ankara that are kind of connected, history really has decided. It's time that the politicians live up to what they're supposed to do. They need to be statesmen.
Now, there has been a time in Turkey when people have been prosecuted and even imprisoned for speaking up about the genocide. Is that still continuing today?
In subtle, slow ways, yes. The pressure, the hints, the implications of potential problems, that happens to individuals. However, as far as the Armenian issue is concerned, no. That's not to say that freedom of speech and freedom of the press is thriving in Turkey. On the contrary, it's one of the most problematic places in the world, although there is a huge journalistic tradition there. So it's changed a little bit, and I think it's changed partly because the international attention, scholarly, public, political, is really on Turkey this year.
Has the sort of dynamic of international communication, given the internet and social media, also made a difference? I mean, young people are able to communicate with one another instantly, strangers instantly, in a way that just has never been possible before.
It's absolutely true. There's information out there in ways that there didn't used to be. And social media in Turkey particularly is huge, and around the world, of course. And as they hear about these things, as they read of Hrant Dink's assassination and wonder why, and begin to think, is this a part of my history? Am I somehow responsible? Who's kept this from me? What do we do now? On the other hand, as you know best, media, social media can only do what it does, and we're all watching what's happening in Syria. In fact, also to the Armenian community there. That's where the refugees ended up. And now that community is, together with the rest of Syrians, are living this horrible tragedy. Yes, we know about it, but then what? We still have to work with the governments, with those in power, to make the changes that we believe are needed.
Sabi, in the end, this is a personal story for so many Armenians. And I want to say my own husband is 1/4 Armenian. His father's side of his family came to the East Coast, decades ago, and also carried this legacy of genocide. Can you share your story? You threw out a few tidbits of it during our interview, but would you mind sharing a little bit of your story?
I'd be pleased to. Happy is probably the wrong word, but I have to tell you, after my grandmother died, it's become harder to tell the story.
Well,
I
in
used
whatever
to,
way you can.
I used to, talk to students, classrooms all the time. My grandmother was 5 years old. She was stolen off the deportation route from her mother's lap, and she ended up with various tribes: Arabs, Kurds, Turks, and she talked always about those experiences, and we were young and we would say don't talk about it, thinking we were helping her. So what the stories of exploitation, abuse, and all of that, we all got tidbits of it, but we were young and didn't know how to process it. We do know that along the deportation route in one of these villages, an older Armenian man, a merchant, came and found that she was Armenian and bought her to take her away, and subsequently married her, and my mother was born. All this before my grandmother was 15. And then she ran away from her husband, surprise, surprise, for which my mother never forgave her. So my grandmother and mother were both raised in an orphanage in Aleppo with Danish missionaries, American missionaries. And my father had also ended up there because his father had been killed along the way, and that's where they married. And hundreds of thousands of Armenians can trace their background now to that. My sister, who, unlike me, has been a quiet mother and wife all these years, just completed a novel called As the Poppies Bloomed, which is about those experiences. It's historical fiction. It's a love story. It's a story of people wanting to live a life. And the reason all of this matters is because it's as if 100 years later, we're all still individually trying to find ways to deal with this. And that's why it is incumbent on everyone, elites, scholars, politicians, governments, to find a resolution, a closure to this. Because at the end of the day, we've lived this, and we continue to live it. Our children shouldn't have to. They should be able to go back to those villages and those cities in peace. Scholars ought to be able to study all this, to understand it, not to justify it, but just to understand it together. And that environment needs to be encouraged. And maybe the 100 years will do it. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Salpi Gazarian is my guest, and she is the executive director of the USC Institute for Armenian Studies. Thank you so
Sonali.
much. Thank you. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Unless California experiences an El Nino-type storm system by the end of the year, the serious 4-year drought affecting the nation's most populous state could continue into the foreseeable future. Already, the agricultural industry is feeling a little of the pinch, with federal water supplies being denied, and Governor Jerry Brown has put in place modest restrictions targeting urban water use. But Nestle, one of the biggest food corporations in the world, has been bottling millions of gallons of California's precious water from the San Bernardino National Forest. An investigation by the Desert Sun found that Nestle's permit to truck the water through the forest expired in 1988. Public outcry over the bottling operation has prompted the U.S. Forest Service to announce that it will prioritize the renewal process of the permit and assess it in terms of the drought. Nestle runs 5 bottling operations in California, Recently, the Swiss company has expanded its bottled water sector in response to growing consumer demand for healthier options to sugary sodas. Nestle's chairman, Peter Brabeck, has come under fire for reportedly asserting that he thinks water is not a human right. However, the company says on its website that, quote, everyone everywhere in the world has the right to clean, safe water for drinking and sanitation. The Courage Campaign is one of the organizations that has recently started a petition calling on state regulators to put an immediate halt to Nestle's bottling operations in California. Joining me now is Eddie Kurtz, Executive Director of the Courage Campaign. Welcome to Uprising, Eddie. Thank you so much for joining us. It looks like we're going to have to call Eddie right back since his audio is not quite working. Again, we are talking about Nestle's bottling operations in the San Bernardino forests in Southern California at a time when, of course, historic drought in California, which could go on for decades, threatens the water supplies for the nation's most populous state. And looks like we have Eddie on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine, Sonali. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Now, Nestle's bottled water brands include San Pellegrino and Perrier and Poland Spring, but the water that it taps from California is marketed under the Arrowhead Springs brand. Nestle says it only takes as much water as one might use to water 2 golf courses a year from the San Bernardino forest. So it's probably a small percentage of all water resources in California, isn't it?
Well, it is in the big picture, yes. California uses a lot more water than that overall. But when you look more specifically about the places they're taking the water from, the San Bernardino forest, but also this plant in Cabazon, which is in the desert. It's in the desert and near Palm Springs, and there are already clear local effects of that taking that groundwater, the precious groundwater in that desert environment. People, human beings in the area are having trouble getting enough water to drink and bathe, as well as their impacts on the natural environment, the Salton Sea, all that is connected here. So it's having a local impact. And then also, I mean, just this is such an egregious use of a precious natural resource in California. We're making an example of this water bottling operation, and we're planning, statewide, there's really no excuse for bottling water when it's such a precious resource.
Now, if water is being used to quench people's thirst, setting aside the horrific use of plastic and the fact that it will fill up our landfills for who knows how long, but just setting that aside, Nestle says, look, people drink this water. It's not an inappropriate use. We shouldn't be angry about it. How do you respond?
Well, the real solution is tap water, because as many studies have shown, the stuff that comes out of those bottles is no different than the tap water that almost anyone can get. Clearly, I mean, Courage Campaign does not have a position against bottled water overall. We encourage people not to use it. But clearly, there are situations when you're in an airport or something where you might choose to use it if you don't have a refillable container. But tap water is really just as good. And I think there needs to be an education campaign around that.
And also, of course, when you're bottling water, you can then ship it wherever, which is what Nestle does. And you do it for profit, right?
Yes. Absolutely. It's profiteering off a natural resource that frankly, the people of California have a right to first and foremost. And they're not just selling it in California. They're taking this precious resource in California and selling it all over the country. And that's crazy.
Right. So taking water out of a desert that's experiencing a terrible drought. How is it that Nestle's permit expired in 1988 and the company has continued extracting and trucking water without a permit for 27 years? I mean, if my driver's license expires and if I get caught, I will get cited or worse. Will Nestle face any kind of a fine or be charged with anything for operating without a permit for so long?
We hope so. That's up to regulators and the legal authorities, and we're following the story closely. We haven't heard anything along those lines yet. So far, the coverage is focused on the Park Service for not checking on the permit, not holding up its end of the bargain. But we certainly think so. And really, I mean, we're against all water bottling in California. We're looking to expand our campaign.
So the U.S. Forest Service says that it's understaffed. It can't keep up with all the paperwork. And now that there's been attention on this issue because of campaigns like yours, because of the investigation by the Desert Sun and other media coverage, it's prioritizing the permit. Aside from the value of activism and media coverage, how do you view this excuse that, well, they're understaffed? I mean, they very well likely might be.
Yeah, no, I think unfortunately, I have friends who work for the National Park Service. I know that's legitimate. I mean, it's not helpful that this Tea Party Congress continually cuts these funding for precious public service like our national parks. This is a reason why why we have a federal government, why it's important that we fund it adequately. And I think this is yet another symptom of this sort of race to the bottom governance that Republicans employ.
What do you make of Nestle's position in general on the issue of water? I mentioned Peter Brabeck, the CEO of Nestle. There's been this video that he of a statement that he made that's just constantly, I'm seeing it on my social media feeds, where he had apparently on a video said that he didn't think that humans had a right to water, and Nestle seems to have backpedaled on this.
Yeah, I mean, that was out there, and there's been a lot of outrage about that. Clearly, Nestle realized that was a liability and has done their best to shift their message on that. Only he knows what he truly thinks in his heart. All we can do is respond to what they're doing in the world, and this is far from the only environmental issue that Nestle is terrible on. You read stories from all over the world, back to the infant formula issue, which evidently is still going on. That was big in the 80s. Nestle's on the wrong side of a lot of things.
Now, the petition, or rather, if you go to Nestle's websites, the top three or four things that complete with these perfect photos are Nestle's commitment to green values, their quote commitment to society, improving animal welfare, dealing with climate change, etc. Is this greenwashing, pure and simple?
Yes. Yeah, it's greenwashing. I mean, their fundamental business model, unfortunately, is anti-environment. I mean, you mentioned the oil used for the bottles, shipping it all over the world, and the energy it takes to do that. I mean, yes, bottled water is better for your health than Coca-Cola, but still, this is not a solution for the 21st century.
And I mentioned that Nestle is expanding its bottled water sector, even as there has been growing awareness in the public about bottled water being terrible for the environment, etc. But they're saying, as you said, bottled water is healthier than sugary sodas. The point, I think, is that as long as there are people who are willing to consume a resource that should simply flow out of their tap that is colored with, various colors and has sugar or bubbles added to it and see that as something special that's worth paying for, Nestle will continue to have business. How much of this is an issue of public education?
I think that's a major part of it. And frankly, just the show, what you're doing, Sonali, what we're doing, it's all part of the picture. Moving people away from sugary drinks is maybe step one, but step two needs to be educating them that they can get that just as high quality water if they open their taps.
So how has the petition on Courage Campaign's website been doing, even though in the grand scheme of things, in terms of how much water California uses overall and how fast it's using compared to how little water is left, this might be not a huge issue. It's angered a lot of people.
Yes, this petition has gone viral in the true sense of the word. We have over 150,000 people who have signed it. It's growing every day. They're not just Californians, they're all over the country. I mean, the California drought is a national and even an international issue, given the importance of California's agriculture sector. And so, everything we post on our social media outlets, you can find Courage Campaign on Facebook and Twitter, everything we post there just goes bonkers. I mean, people are sharing it, commenting on it, they're outraged by it. And as we've discussed, this is a small part of California's drought problem. It's not, if we stopped all water bottling in California today, it would not solve the drought. But you know what? We're engaged. We're online community organizers. That's what Courage Campaign does, and we're engaging people through this issue. It's very outrageous. It's very motivating. And then very soon, in fact, tomorrow, we'll likely be pivoting to an even larger, broader strategy to take on the California drought at the scale that's required.
Aha! Any chance you could give us a preview of that?
Yeah, sure. I actually think that's totally fine. And I'd love to come back on and talk about it more once it's developed. But, we feel it's very important for California's leaders, Governor Brown in particular, to take on this historic drought with a historic solution. You can look at what Australia did in the last 10, 15 years to attack the millennium drought down there. They radically changed the way that their country handles water and regulates water. California's water allocation system has bedeviled us before we were even a state. And the state legislature hasn't changed the laws around it since 1914. And it is a mess. It is a phenomenal mess. And it's time for a leader, and there isn't a better leader to take it on than Jerry Brown in his fourth term, in his last term, to take on this challenge and find a real sustainable way for California to align its water, its agriculture system and its water use in general with its water supplies. Climate change has permanently changed California's water supplies and will continue to change that. It will diminish it. And we have to build an agriculture system and just an overall water use system that meets that. Right now, we're making up the difference by drawing down groundwater, which has been put there over hundreds of thousands of years, and it's hard to replenish. Once you deplete those aquifers completely, they can't be replenished. It's crazy. It's basically like our water savings account, and we're drawing down that savings account now with no plan for tomorrow. And we have to change that. We have to do something.
And of course, this is a very much a national issue. You inferred earlier that California supplies much of the country, something like one third to a half of all the produce consumed in the United States is grown in California's Central Valley, a desert, which is, just a kind of a ludicrous set of conditions if you think about it, violating principles of local consumption of food as well as just ecological sensibility. So finally, on the issue of Nestle's permit, if we go back to the original story and this narrow part of the story, Nestle has been operating for 27 years without a permit. It's coming up for renewal. Is it still continuing its bottling operations now that it's known that the permit has expired, or has it temporarily halted its operations as far as you know?
My understanding is that the bottling continues.
Wow.
Absolutely.
And so I'm assuming, or we hope, that the public will have a chance to have some input into the renewal process?
Yeah, so our ears are to the ground trying to learn. Right now, the Park Service says they're in the information gathering phase, and this could take 18 months or plus, to figure it all out. Obviously, that timeline is too long. It's unacceptable. I imagine there are some very hardworking public servants trying to figure this out.
But it's still outrageous. I mean, Eddie, going back to this issue, if I was pulled over by a cop and found to be caught with an expired driver's license, I am not going to be allowed to continue to drive with that expired license until I get a new one in place. I will have to stop driving until I renew my license. But those rules don't apply to corporations like Nestle, it seems.
I agree with that statement, absolutely. And hopefully, the State Water Resources Control Board or other authorities can step in here and stop it. I agree with you 100%. It's become very clear in our Citizens United world that corporations operate under a different set of rules. We're trying to hold them accountable and do all we can to change that. But you're right. As of now, they operate under different rules than you and I.
And the website where people can find the petition that your organization has put out?
CourageCampaign.org.
That's couragecampaign.org, and we'll post it to uprisingwithsonali.com later today. I want to thank you so much, Eddie, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for giving voice to this important issue, Sonali.
Thanks so much. Eddie Kurtz is Executive Director of Courage Campaign, and couragecampaign.org is where you can join 150,000 others in signing a petition against Nestle's bottling operations in California. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Corinne Gaston is our intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.